president of the French and Indian War Society at Lake George. And as you would imagine, growing up in Lake George and growing up at Fort William Henry, as my family started the company and worked here, all of our vacations were museums and churches. So I still love museums and churches. And it's wonderful, absolutely wonderful to see this group of people coming here to certainly hear our esteemed professor, but also to recognize the significance of our area and the last of the Mohicans and what it meant to us and how people can understand fact from fiction, because that certainly does get confusing at times. So this is a very quick welcome. I'm sorry for the length of that. I want to tell you a couple of things we're doing here. We have a book signing this Saturday at our supper shop with Joe Zarzinski. We also have a surrender ceremony on August 9th, where we will once again surrender to the French out in front of the fort. So if you want to see that again, a very sad moment, please come by on August 9th. We cry every time. We also will follow it with laying the wreath at the grave of the unknown soldier. There will also be another book signing on August 12th at our supper shop, and our community days, which you're all welcome to, is between August 12th and August 13th, where for $1 admission, you are welcome to come to our museum. We have another book signing on the 13th, which is with Russell Dunn and Barbara Delaney, authors of the Trails with Tales book series. And August 18th, our Last of the Mohicans interactive movie, where you should definitely be ready to hear cannons and guns and enjoy Daniel Day-Lewis in front of you. So thank you very much for coming. Thank you for celebrating history and understanding how significant it is to our future and to our present. And I would like to welcome our Assemblyman, Matt Simpson. Thank you.
Thank you, Kathy, and I want to thank you and your team for all that you do for our community. I've spent a lot of time here this week with various events, and I also want to thank you all for being here. I've been fortunate enough to have lived here in the village. I was just talking about it earlier. Back in the 70s, I was about 9 years old, and I can remember my friends and I, amongst pool hopping with all the motel owners and all the things here, but just being immersed in the fact of, you know, the history and what this area entails, and we would, you know, reenact our own little French and Indian wars in the woods up off by the town hall. But it was just a wonderful thing, and I look back and I have such fond memories of going to school and just being part of and learning about our history here. And as soon as I had heard about this presentation tonight, I signed up and wanted to be here. I wasn't intending to speak, but I'm so excited to be here that this is great. And I want to thank you all for being here and taking part in this. Thank you.
Good evening, everyone. My name is John Danuzzo. I'm the president of the Lake George Battlefield Park Alliance, the co-sponsor of tonight's program, along with the French and Indian War Society. And it heartens us to see all of you here, as you have been coming for our programs throughout the last 6 or 8 months. It's really impressive, I think, not only within the community, but also to the larger region, that there's this much interest in our history. And tonight, we have the convergence of the terrific history of American history of Lake George, but also literary history, where Lake George is so prominent with the Last of the Mohicans. When you think about it, it was precisely 266 years ago today that the siege of Fort William Henry began. And so if you conceive of that in the context of where we're standing, sitting, where we're roaming around tonight, if we were here 266 years ago, we would be hearing gunfire, cannons, all sorts of horror in terms of the beginning of the siege that lasted for, I think, 7 days until that surrender occurred that Kathy referred to. So it's significant to America when we talk about that anniversary is certainly significant, as Nick will be telling us, to the literary history of the world and of our country. As one of our trustees, Russ Bellico, said, there is no event in the French and Indian War, in his considered opinion, that's more memorable than the siege of Fort William Henry and the aftermath. And that's largely thanks to James Fenimore Cooper's commemoration of it, but also at contemporary times. It was just such a significant and horrific event for the British that it lasted, it stuck in people's minds, and I think motivated the British, the provincials who fought for the British, i.e. the Americans, and even through 20 years later when the revolution began, that was still an important part, I think, of the makeup of the Patriot soldiers. I'll talk just momentarily about the Lake George Battlefield Park Alliance. I know I see many familiar faces here. We have a lot of our members here. We've been doing programs over the last several months about Henry Knox, Philip Schuyler, the Battle of Lake George, the Native American history within the region. And we have a lot more to come. So I encourage you to learn more about our programs. For those who have our literature, go to our website and learn more about what we have coming up in August, September, October, and actually coming to winter as well. I'd encourage you certainly to join us as we help to not only preserve Lake George Battlefield Park and the significance that that has in American history, but also the wider community of the history of Lake George, Warren County region, which is very significant. And is an important part of that is our visitor center. I think it's a great complement to Fort William Henry and to the Lake George Historical Museum, the old courthouse building, that our visitor center now in its second year, I think has obtained a certain niche in terms of what it represents, the artifacts there that are from the battlefield park, reflecting both the French and Indian War and the American Revolution. That visitor center is open 5 days a week, Thursday through Monday, closed Tuesday and Wednesday, from 10 until 4. We encourage you to visit there, and also to participate in our Saturday tours, which are free, starting at 11 o'clock every Saturday. We have guided tours of the battlefield park that take 1 hour, and you get kind of a medley of what happened within the battlefield park. So I won't go any further in describing, but I encourage you to learn more about the history of the region and to take our literature and use it and learn from it as well. But the important thing tonight is to hear from our friend Dr. Nick Junkerman of Skidmore. Nick has a bachelor's degree from Oberlin College in Ohio, a PhD from the University of California, Berkeley. And as we will learn, his expertise and his, I think his most inspired work is done with early American literature, particularly 19th century literature. What happened in the French and Indian War was in the 18th century, but as we learn, it was 70 years later before James Fenimore Cooper wrote The Last of the Mohicans that we'll hear more about. So to present Cooper, the history and fiction in The Last of the Mohicans, Dr. Nick Junkerman. Nick.
I'll just spend 20 minutes getting my laptop on this. Thank you, all three of you, for that generous introduction, and John in particular for all the work you've done to make this possible, and to the Lake George Battlefield Park Alliance and the French and Indian War Society for making it possible for me to talk tonight, and to all of you for coming out. I likewise am impressed that so many people turned out to hear about Cooper tonight. Andrew, you'd like to say? As John mentioned, I am an English professor, a literary historian, I guess you might say. I am not a historian, and certainly not military historian, so I'm going to be doing some relying tonight on the collective wisdom of the folks here in the crowd to talk about the details of the battle. I will mention them briefly, but really my interest here tonight and the thing that I most want to talk to you about is this intersection of history and fiction, in general, but particularly in this book. How they come together, how they conflict with each other, how they harmonize, how they rub up against each other, all sorts of interesting interactions I think that I want to dig into with you tonight. How many of you have read this book? Oh, look at that. I misjudged my words. How many of you have read this book in the last 10 years? Smaller number. How many of you have seen Michael Mann's 1992 film, Lost in the Mohicans? So lots of us there. I think one of the things that is always my job when I'm talking about early American novels, but maybe particularly with this one, is to try to unburden it a little bit of the associations that we have with it, right? Half memories, and particularly, I think, in the case of a novel that's been the subject of so many media representations, particularly that very successful and I think excellent 1992 film, I want to get us back a little bit to the book itself. And the way that I do this when I'm working with my students at Skidmore is I often have them look at the title page of the first edition. Title pages are always interesting, even today. They have valuable information for us. But in the 18th and 19th centuries, they're really packed with information about the intentions of the author, about the history of the publication, about how someone like Cooper imagines a book like this making its way into the world, how he wants to introduce it, how his publisher wants to introduce it. The novel, as you probably can't quite see here, isn't big as I could make it, but is published in 1826. And as it says right above there, it's published in a 2-volume edition. So the sort of core of my talk tonight, the core of what brings us all here together, the story of the siege and its aftermath, comes right at the juncture of those 2 volumes, right at the end of the first volume and spilling over into the beginning of the second one. So my talk will focus on that first half or so of the novel, although I'll mention the second half briefly at the end here. This was Cooper's 6th novel, and his second in what will come to be called the Leatherstocking Tales. It takes him a little less than a year to write this book. He starts in the late winter, early spring of 1825, and the book comes out at the very beginning of 1826, figure January, February, something like that. Cooper had enjoyed substantial literary success before, but The Last of the Mohicans was a particular hit. The sale of the copyright to his publisher, that's Carey and Lee down there in Philadelphia, a new publisher, it was his first outing with them, fetches him $5,000, which was a handsome sum at the time. I've seen estimates in the range of $100,000 in today's money. And the initial run of 5,000 sells out very quickly. And as you know, it's gone on to long popularity in America and across the world. Remains his best-known book, although he wrote dozens of them, seafaring novels in addition to the Leatherstocking Tales. Importantly, thinking back to that idea of sort of unpacking this book and defamiliarizing it a little bit. We're so used, I think, to that phrase, Last of the Mohicans, but what does that actually mean? I'd point out that the title of this book, importantly, is not focused on the character Natty Bumppo or Hawkeye or Long Carabine, he goes by many names, right? It's not even focused on the political and military conflicts of the French and Indian War that have partly brought us together tonight. It's focused on a Native American individual, a man that over the course of the book we'll learn is named Uncas, but here it identifies him by a description, by a title, The Last of the Mohicans. And in so doing, it contains an idea about the nature and the fate of the Mohicans, and also about Native Americans in general, which I think is best expressed in this quote from Cooper's preface. Like an English teacher, I'm going to move sort of slowly through this one, so if you feel like you're back in English class, that's precisely the idea. He says the Mohicans were the possessors of the country first occupied by the Europeans in this portion of the continent. They were consequently the first dispossessed, and the seemingly inevitable fate of all these people who disappear before the advances, or it might be termed the inroads of civilization, as the verdure of the native forests, their native forests, falls before the nipping frosts, is represented as having already befallen them. There is sufficient historical truth in the picture to justify the use that has been made of it. So, in this passage, Cooper first highlights the dispossession of native people, the loss of their lands, right? And he seems, to me at least, to feel some ambivalence about this fact, right? He terms this first a loss in the face of the advances of civilization, which is a positive term, or at least a neutral one, right? But then he hesitates a little bit and switches to the idea of inroads. Inroads being an exchange in which one gains and another necessarily loses. There's some regret there, perhaps, at what's been lost. But look what he does right after that. He frames or compares this process to a natural process, imagining the Mohicans being like the green leaves that are swept away by nipping frosts. This is a seasonal image, and if a little bit mournful, I think also a little bit calming, right? This happens every year. It's a really common idea in the literature and rhetoric of this period in the 1820s. This is the moment when the Indian Removal Act and the idea of Indian removal is being hotly debated, and then by the 1830s, by 1830, the act is passed. In his 1830 State of the Union address, after the passage of that same act, Andrew Jackson strikes a similar note to what we see here. He says, "To follow to the tomb the last of his race, and to tread on the grave of extinct nations excites melancholy reflections." That same feeling of sadness, right? But then he says, "But true philanthropy reconciles the mind to these vicissitudes, these changes, as it does to the extinction of one generation to make room for another." You see what he does there? It's the same thing that Cooper does. A natural process, right? It's not humans doing things to other humans anymore. It's nature taking its course. It should hardly need mentioning that you don't have to pass acts of Congress to make the seasons change or to have fathers give way to sons, right? This is a convenient fiction as the hunger for land grows and as the Trans-Allegheny frontier fills with white settlers. Right? And Cooper himself acknowledges at the end here the slightly inconvenient fact that this isn't true, right? That Uncas, who we meet in this book, was not the last of the Mohicans. And in fact, the Mohicans are not gone when he's publishing and are not gone today, right? But he says there is sufficient truth, close enough in the terms of historical fiction. I'm going to return to this idea at the end of the talk. But I open here the idea of fictionalizing history, right? And I want to think about the way that these conversations about actual truth and imagination are relevant to another element of this title page. I promise you, this will be the last thing that I pick out of this title page here. But notice that he calls it a narrative of 1767. And in his preface, again, he says, "The reader who takes up these volumes in expectation of finding an imaginary and romantic picture of things which never had an existence will probably lay them aside, disappointed. The work is exactly what it professes to be in its title page, a narrative." In calling it a narrative, and in making these remarks about imaginary or romantic pictures of things, he's distinguishing this from the trifling novel, right? With its invented plots and its romantic set and imaginary settings, or as in some strains of Gothic fiction, an emphasis on ghosts or the supernatural or something like that. This, I think, implicitly is meant to be more serious stuff, although it is fiction, right? In this, he's following importantly in the steps of Sir Walter Scott, whose Waverley novels, which fictionalize primarily Scottish history and begin their course of publication in 1814, are hugely popular in this period, right? Not just in Britain, but in America as well. There are stories like there are about Dickens of people lining up on the wharves, hoping that a ship has brought over right? And Americans in this young republic are beginning to issue calls for someone to do for their history what Scott has done for the history of Scotland, right? He is answering a call for the creation of what will eventually be called a national literature here, right? And this works, I think, remarkably. He eventually comes to be called the American Scot, although he hates the title, right? So he's not the first American to write fiction about the past, but the way that he insists in this preface on the importance of history, and he sort of lays his research out for us, right? Here is the facts that I consulted. Here are the experts that I've looked into in order to write this book for you, similar to what Scott does. In this distinction from an imaginary and romantic picture, he's doing something relatively new and important here. Note also 1767 here, right? This takes place not once upon a time, but in a particular year. I'll say also before I go here, that I think this emphasis on narrative and history and factuality is maybe a little bit of protesting too much on Cooper's part, because notice what he does down here, too. You probably can't read this either, but it says, "Mislike me not from my complexion the shadowed livery of the burnished sun," which is a quote from Shakespeare's Merchant of Venice. It's the Prince of Morocco speaking these lines. This not only suggests the book's interest in skin color and its relationship to character, but it also points to its connection, again, to imaginative literature. Now, this is supposed to be high-tone imaginative literature, right? Only the most elegant stuff. But nonetheless, it's that, right? This is one of Shakespeare's comedies, and its imaginative plots help to structure this fictional work as well, right? So we are dancing here again back and forth between these ideas of history and fiction, and already seeing some of the ways in which the division of the two is impossible, maybe for anyone, but certainly for Cooper. So who is the man who writes this work? Right? Here he is, James Fenimore Cooper, 1789 to 1851. We see him here as a youngish man, would have been 32, 33 when this was painted. John Wesley Jarvis, a society painter, paints this picture of him. Cooper, as many of you probably know, was born to William Cooper and Elizabeth Fenimore. He wouldn't add the Fenimore to his own name until 1826, the same year that this book came out. His father made a fortune developing land in upstate New York. He's the founder of Cooperstown on Lake Otsego. And Cooper himself moved there as a baby, he was a year old, to what was then real frontier country, although it wouldn't stay that way for very long. And he would, in this place of his boyhood, been exposed not only to the woods, right, some version of that primeval forest, but also to Native Americans and to frontiersmen of the leatherstocking type, right? So to a certain extent, he writes of what he knows or experienced as a young man in Cooperstown. William, his father, dies in 1809, and he leaves his son a large inheritance. But it's mostly in real estate, and that real estate is, as we would say today, mostly highly leveraged, right? So that fortune is gone in a little over 10 years, right? It's lost to bad debts, to the collapse of land values after the War of 1812, and a little bit to James's own mismanagement of his money, right? He's never truly poor. His wife, luckily, Susan, is also from inherited wealth, but by the time he comes out with his first book in 1820, this book is called Persuasion. It's an imitation of an English novel. He is in need of money. So partly the turn to authorship is about trying to make a living, right? But it's also colored by this sense of loss, this sense that he has lost the genteel birthright of a frontier aristocrat, if that makes sense. We can imagine in this way that both Uncas, the last of the Mohicans, and Natty Bumppo could be fantasy projections of a version of Cooper himself, right? Ways that he might imagine himself at this moment. When he writes The Last of the Mohicans, he's in his mid-30s, 36, 37. And Natty Bumppo, importantly, is a character in this book, in all of these books, but the chronology of his life is a little scrambled, and he doesn't plan this from the start as a series of books about Natty Bumppo or leatherstocking. The character sort of emerges and evolves along with these works. Right? We don't need to get too much into the details of this, but know that when the first book comes out, it's set with Natty Bumppo in his 70s, right? In a fictionalization of Cooperstown. The Last of the Mohicans, Natty Bumppo is 40. And then in the prairie, he's jumped ahead to his 80s. We find him out on the western prairie. He's leaping about, right? And Cooper, in response to his readers, in response again to the need for money, returns again to this topic in the 1840s, some 16 years or so after, 13 years after he finishes the prairie, and fills in some of the earlier details of Natty's life when he's 42 and 24. So the Natty Bumppo that we meet in the movie, for example, is a different man than we meet in this book. I'm going to move toward the story of the siege, but I want to talk about just a few more elements here before we get there to set the scene and to sort of establish us in the book. I want to talk a little bit about the setting of this work. Right? This novel gets its start, interestingly enough, I think, through aristocratic tourism. In 1824, James Cooper would serve as a tour guide for a group of 4 young English gentlemen who were visiting America. He joined them, and he's famous enough at this time that they're keen to meet him, right? That's the reason that this happens. But he joins them at Saratoga, and they journey up, stopping at Glens Falls, and then proceeding on to the southern end of Lake George, where they would have seen the ruins of Fort William Henry, right? And this is Cooper's first visit to the region, and it takes him to some of the key locations for the Last of the Mohicans, and in fact, it's at what we would call Glens Falls that Edward Smith Stanley, who's the future Prime Minister of England and the most sort of prominent member of this book, remembers Cooper saying, I must place one of my old Indians here, right? This is the anecdote about Edward and Matthew, sort of the light bulb moment. I'll write this book, right? This idea that place inspires this story is important because this book is so in love with its place, right? It's so much about this region and in some ways so careful about its elaboration of the different places that they go, right? And its descriptions of places like Lake George and what we would call Boston Spa. But we have to remember also that this is an imaginary place that Cooper is recreating, right? And one that he wouldn't have seen himself. By the time he arrives there, he's 70 years past 1857, right? And the falls have begun to look a little bit more like this, right? This is an engraving from after an oil painting from the period, right? So we have a mill here and a bridge. And Cooper complains in a footnote that the application of the water to the uses of civilized life has materially injured its beauties, right? You would be amazed to see it today, right? The towering industry that surrounds it, right? And the kind of progress that is exciting, necessary, and also about which Americans have always felt a little bit ambivalent, right? How do you reconcile the romantic with the vast changes that are happening in the 1820s all around Cooper, right? And that world that's gone and the world that's coming, right? So, keep teasing the point, it's coming. I want to talk quickly to you about the characters here in this book, right? And how Cooper details them and also how he divides them up. So there are only 2 verifiably historical figures who are major characters in this novel. Colonel Monroe and the Marquis de Montcalm, who are the leaders of the British and the French sides of this conflict, respectively. Right? In the novel, Colonel Monroe has 2 daughters, whose names are Cora and Alice, and you see them there on the upper left-hand side. The actual Lieutenant Colonel George Monroe, who died at Albany shortly after the surrender, seems to have had no children, and we don't even know that he was married, nor is there evidence that, as the novel suggests, he served in the West Indies, so I think we want to think of him as an elaboration from a historical figure, but certainly firmly grounded in a man who exists, as was Montcalm. Natty Bumppo, on the other hand, is a composite character, right? Someone who might have been built out of people that Cooper encountered, right? There's a sort of cottage industry connecting him to particular figures in history. There's a David Shipman who has kind of a leading role. People say, well, he must have been the man or something like that. But I think it's most helpful to think of Natty Bumppo as being someone that Cooper put together out of the materials of his life and his experience, but mostly out of his imagination. And reminding you again that the Natty Bumppo that we meet here is not the romantic hero, not the love interest that we meet in Daniel Day-Lewis in the film, right? For one thing, he's older, he's 40, right? He's a skilled woodsman and a loyal friend to Chingachgook, but he's also an obedient and loyal servant to the British Crown, right? Another thing about Daniel Day-Lewis is that he's a bit of a rebel, right? He has that sort of devil-may-care attitude. That's really not the man who's depicted in this book, right? He is independent and proud of his independence, but he's also very aware of his class position and very ready to defer in the face of authority, which I think makes an interesting sort of adjustment to the image that we may have of the frontier individualist that Natty Bumppo is a sort of early type of. Duncan Hayward, who you see right there among the Americans below Natty Bumppo, is a young Southern-born major in the 60th Regiment of Royal Americans. He's also brave and loyal, but he's not at ease in the woods or in the Indian world in the way that Natty is, right? This is another way that the characters get divided up, the degree to which they are comfortable in this wild space. Really importantly here also, we see Cooper's separation of the native peoples of the Northeast into two opposing groups. One group, up here, is noble, brave, and friendly to the book's protagonists. These are the Mohicans. This is a tribe that's part of the larger Lenni Lenape or Delaware grouping, and they are represented by Chingachgook and by his son Uncas. Uncas, again, is the titular last of the Mohicans. The other group of native peoples, as depicted in this book, is vicious, treacherous, savage, and the chief antagonists of the book. These are the Iroquois people down here, including the Huron and the Mohawks. Hawkeye and his companions, if you've read the book, also call them Mingo or Mengwe or Makwa, which are all pejorative Delaware terms for Iroquois peoples. Cooper identifies them in the book using heavily racialized language. He calls them dusky and savage over and over and over again, which is something that he doesn't do with his favorite Mohican characters. These antagonists are represented, are sort of crystallized in the figure of Magua, who is a Huron adopted by the Mohawks and who bears a grudge against General Monroe, or excuse me, Major Monroe, Colonel Monroe. I called him a major before too, didn't I? Man, I'm already in trouble, I can feel it. He bears a grudge against Colonel Monroe, who had him whipped when he was drunk, right? So he has a sort of original motivation, but his hunger for revenge in the book seems to outrun this paper-thin motivation. And by the end of the book, Cooper is comparing him to Satan himself, right? He says, at such moments, it would not have been difficult to have fancied the dusky savage of the Prince of Darkness, as the Prince of Darkness, brooding on his fancied wrongs and plotting evil, right? He's all but twirling his mustache, right? Cooper gets the outline of this opposition and the idea that the Mohicans were the good guys from Johannes Heckwelder, who was a missionary among the Mohicans and whose book, which came out in 1819, was quite popular. Cooper himself admits that there's some simplification of a complex ethnic and political landscape here. And as I was saying to someone who came up before the talk, it's not always entirely clear who Cooper is talking about historically here when he identifies these groups. Uncas, for example, is the name of a Mohegan sachem. The Mohegans are a eastern Connecticut group connected to the Mohicans, also Lenni Lenape, but frequently confused with them, right? And that may be what's happening in the book itself. Before we get to the book, the last slide. I want to give you a brief overview of Volume 1 to show you how the book gets us to the moment of the siege. So the Monroe girls, who are Cora and Alice, and they're accompanied by Duncan Hayward, are leaving Fort Edward to join their father at Fort William Henry. He is besieged at the time. This is a singularly ill-considered voyage. It seems to me, I don't, even after having studied the book carefully, understand quite why they're going to join him. But they're led by Magua, who is secretly allied with the French. The group meets up with Natty Bumppo and Chingachgook and his son Uncas, and when they discover Magwa's deception, he flees and the group escapes again to the caves at Glens Falls. Hawkeye and the Mohicans hold off Magwa and his allies for a while, but eventually they flee, promising to return. Magwa leads his captives south to the area that's now occupied by Boston Spa. There, Chingachgook, Uncas, and Hawkeye catch up with them and free the captives. This completes the first cycle of capture by the evil Magwa and successful pursuit by the brave and skillful trio, and then this will be repeated again in the second book. This captivity narrative is a fundamental pattern in the book. Once the party is out of danger from the Hurons, Hawkeye leads them again back to Fort William Henry. Right? The scene of the siege, Cooper's description of the siege, begins with their arrival from the south, passing by Bloody Pond, where Hawkeye tells the story of the engagement from 1755 that he was a part of, and takes us up to a scene on a mountaintop where they can look down and get really a bird's eye view of the conflict as it's laid out before them. This is from an eminence something like Prospect Mountain up to that. So here, right. The following chapters tell the story of the siege, with Cooper mostly adjusting historical events to allow the central figures of the battle and his own fictional characters to play important roles, to be sort of in the middle of the action, right? But much of the general tone of these chapters follows the outlines of the history, and especially Monroe's increasingly desperate and fruitless pleas for assistance from Fort Edward, and then the delicate negotiations with the besieging French armies, right? A couple of individual instances that I want to point out here, and thinking about how he handles the details of that. There's a famous letter that's sent from Webb at Fort Edward to Monroe at Fort William Henry on August 4th. The actual messengers from Edward to Fort William Henry were captured, and the letter carrier was killed. The letter is discovered and kept for later use by Montcalm, right? Cooper keeps some of this idea, but he has Hawkeye, of course, carry the message. Hawkeye comes back, is captured, he's returned, the letter is kept again for later use. Cooper also makes a big deal out of two parleys, two encounters that happen between the opposing forces. The historical parleys involve, the first one involves Louis-Antoine de Bougainville, who is Montcalm's aide-de-camp, in which he delivers the letter from Webb, that famous letter, right? This takes place on August the 7th. And then another parley takes place on Surrender Day, in which Colonel John Young is responsible for negotiating terms with the French. In Cooper's dramatization of this, the first parley happens between Montcalm and Hayward, who goes in Monroe's place. Right? And I think the way that Cooper handles these is actually artful and interesting. There are small details in here. Montcalm speaks in this first parley with Hayward, of his inability to control his native allies. As he puts it, quote, "I find it difficult, even now, to limit them to the usages of war." This is not just a little bit of novelistic foreshadowing, but, as Russell Bellico notes, this was an element of Montcalm's August 3rd request to Monroe for an immediate surrender, right? I think there's a little bit of good cop, bad cop happening here, right? I'll give you the best treatment I can, but my friends, I can't promise anything from them, right? But it's also an important indication that Montcalm's mastery over this coalition of allies is maybe not as strong as he would let on, right? And it prepares us for what will happen in the ensuing chapters and the events of the massacre in the aftermath, right? In the second surrender parley on the 9th, in which Hayward and Monroe meet directly with Montcalm on the ground between the French lines and the fort, the direct contact gives Cooper a chance to cover the terms of the surrender, which were quite generous, and to sketch the characters of the opposing commanders. He says, as soon as this slight salutation had passed, Montcalm moved toward them with a quick but graceful step, baring his head to the veteran and dropping his spotless plume nearly to the earth in courtesy. I think the movie does a very funny job of dramatizing this. If the air of Monroe was more commanding and manly, it wanted both the ease and insinuating polish of the Frenchman. Neither spoke for a few moments, each regarding the other with curious and interested eyes. So noticing that Cooper has a moment here to prepare us again for the blame that he's going to lay on Montcalm for what comes later, right? And to suggest that one half of this conflict is essentially noble, and the other half is skillful but perhaps treacherous, slippery, right? The insinuating Montcalm. These events dispatched, Cooper turns to the events of what has been known almost since the moment as the massacre. This is where the novel reaches its emotional crescendo in the aftermath of the siege, right at the end of the first volume. Cooper neglects the killings that happened inside the fort on August 9th, the day of the surrender, but he gives extensive and detailed attention to the events of the 10th. He captures some of the confusion in the departure from the entrenched camp the day after the surrender. There's a tense period in which he describes aloof French soldiers and pilfering provincials and menacing native warriors. But when the violence breaks loose, his descriptions are blood-soaked and I think it's fair to say lurid. He begins by describing the murder of a baby, and then he has Magua, his chief native antagonist, let out a war whoop that begins the attack on the retreating column. And here's the description that follows. Apologies for the bloodiness of this. I haven't printed the whole thing, but you'll see me as I get to the end here come to what I think is maybe the most important moment. He says, more than 2,000 raving savages broke from the forest at the signal and threw themselves across the fatal plain with instinctive alacrity. We shall not dwell on the revolting horrors that succeeded. He absolutely will dwell on the resulting horrors that succeeded. Death was everywhere, he says, and in his most terrific and disgusting aspects. Resistance only served to inflame the murderers, who inflicted their furious blows long after their victims were beyond the power of resentment. The flow of blood might be likened to the outbreaking of a torrent. Here, I pick him up again. You see that, right? The outbreaking of a torrent. And as the natives became heated and maddened by the sight, many among them even kneeled to the earth and drank freely, exultingly, hellishly of the crimson tide, right? They are literally bloodthirsty in this moment, is the idea, right? Cooper elaborates and emphasizes this imagery, but I think it's really important that we know that he doesn't invent this set of tropes, this way of describing this action. He borrows much of it, in fact, from what's perhaps his most important source on Fort William Henry, which is Jonathan Carver's Travels Through America in the years 1766, 67, and 68. Carver was a member of the Massachusetts colonial forces at the time of the siege, and he includes an eyewitness account of the aftermath in his book, which was published in 1778. You'll see I have it quoted below there. By this time, reading from Carver here, the war whoop was given, and the Indians began to murder those that were nearest to them without distinction. It is not in the power of words to give any tolerable idea of the horrid scene that now ensued. Men, women, and children were dispatched in the most wanton and cruel manner and immediately scalped. Many of these savages drank the blood of their victims as it flowed warm from the fatal wound. Right? It seems clear that terrible things happened on August 10th, 1757. But I hope also in reading this, we can begin to get a sense of how the language that's used to describe these events can color our sense of them, can color our sense of what's going on here. I'll return to this, right? But this is the fictionalization, the interaction finally between history and language, right? In the opening of Volume 2, Cooper lingers again on the horrors that are left behind by the attack, and he imagines the characters again searching for the captive daughters who have been captured by Magua again in the bloody ruins of the fort. Here's his language. The young warrior had halted over a group of females who lay in a cluster, a confused mass of dead. Notwithstanding the revolting horror of the exhibition, Monroe and Hayward flew toward the festering heap, endeavoring with a love that no unseemliness could extinguish to discover whether any vestiges of those they sought were to be seen among the tattered and many-colored garments. This emotionally charged spectacle, again, draws from one of his important sources. In this case, it's David Humphrey's essay on the life of Israel Putnam. Putnam, who served with Rogers Rangers and would later on be a hero of the Revolutionary War, provided another key eyewitness account, this time of the aftermath of the battle, and I have it for you below there. The fort was demolished, the barracks, the outhouses, and the sutlers' booths were heaps of ruins. The fires not yet extinct, and the smoke offensive from the mucilaginous nature of the fuel. You can feel them getting into these details. But illy concealed innumerable fragments of human skulls and bones, and in some instances, carcasses half consumed. Dead bodies, weltering in blood, were everywhere to be seen, violated with all the wanton mutilations of savage ingenuity. One of the things that many readers have noted about Cooper's book is how much blood there is in it, right? And I acknowledge that, and I also want to suggest that that's always been part of telling the story of this event, right? This was a bloody event, and the language that's used to describe it emphasizes and sometimes welters in that blood. Right? So many things that we could say about this event and about Cooper's fictionalization of it, but given time, I want to sort of cut to the chase and ask the question that might be on people's minds, but that I want to nuance a little bit, which is, how accurate is Cooper's discussion of the massacre and the events of the siege? It seems to me, as it seemed to other readers to varying degrees, that the factual outlines of the events at Fort William Henry in August of 1757 are broadly correct. I don't think Cooper substantially gets it wrong, or something like that. There are, though, as I've acknowledged, some important divergences from the historical record as we have it now, and then again this issue of the intensity of the description and the way in which it might skew our understanding of the events. I have a few thoughts about why Cooper portrayed these events in this way, and I've given you the headers up here. The first of these is entertainment, right? No one comes to a novel to be bummed out. Right? If you don't like a novel, you put it down, right? And they've lost you. And you don't recommend it to your friend, right? So Cooper, like any novelist, is aware that he has to keep us on the hook, right? And this novel does that by placing its romanticized central characters at the center of the action and by distilling the complexity of history into the motivations of certain individuals and the consequences of their actions, right? So we have the cowardly web and the devilish Magua and the scheming, treacherous Montcalm, for example, right? That's the logic of this novel, and maybe it's the logic of most novels, right, to tell stories in that way. There's also the question of his sources, which I've already alluded to, right? He was using a handful of historical and primary sources. He worked at this, but he didn't do what we might think of today as full historical research, right? The killing of the sick and the wounded within the fort on the 9th, for example, is a set of facts that were probably just not available to him. They're not mentioned in Carver or in Humphreys or in Timothy White's travels in New England and New York, which is another one of his important sources. Ian Steele, in his book Betrayals, points out that Cooper also didn't consult French sources who might have offered a more balanced perspective, like Pierre Roubaud's account or Bougainville's journals. And the last version, and maybe the most important here, I've given the title of propaganda, but maybe I want to call it a motivated version of history, right? Motivated not just by a desire to understand by the facts, but to create a certain reaction in your audience. Almost immediately after the siege, and some of you no doubt are familiar with this history, accounts of the attack begin to appear that seek to shape the political interpretation of these events. Colonial newspapers ran an account of the events on August 22nd. This is not even 2 weeks after it takes place, right? They're printed by government order in 2 New York papers, and they blame this whole thing entirely and squarely on the French, their enemies at the time, right? And they say, to what a pitch of perfidy and cruelty is the French nation arrived. Would not an ancient heathen shudder with horror on hearing so hideous a tale, right? And then the article goes on to encourage Englishmen to set aside their noble scruples and slaughter any French captives that they happen to find. Right? They pull no punches here. Right? And it's hard to see the idea of savagery confined to any one side here, frankly, for me. So the uses that were made of this attack after the fact, and that would probably take up their own talk, right? I don't have time to cover all of them, but we see here that these terrible events, this effort to make them wake strong feelings in the reader and to advance a certain version of history, is an immediate feature of the story of the massacre, right? I keep doing that because massacre itself, of course, is a loaded term, right? Tends to be a term that we use for what other people do, right? Rather than for what our own armies do. I mean, in fairness, it seems to me that the killing of unarmed people in large numbers qualifies for the definition of a massacre, but I think we want to be alert to its political and emotional weight, right? So this story is sensationalized from the outset, and Cooper follows in that tradition. That's why I think it's hard, finally, for me to conclusively separate history and fiction, which is the kind of thing that an English professor would say, right? But I just don't think it's accurate to think of Cooper as possessing a set of incontrovertible facts that he reaches into and twists around to fit his romantic story, if that makes sense, right? There wasn't some supply of raw history or pure fact that could be separated from people's feelings and their traumas and their motivations, right? This event would have been distantly, but still within living memory of people in 1826. He was working here not just with a limited set of sources that had their own biases, but with a complicated and emotionally charged set of events. This event has been compared to the Alamo, or you might think of Remember the Maine, or Pearl Harbor, or to some extent perhaps 9/11 too, in being a tragedy, but also one that is used to evoke feeling and used to political ends after the fact as well. Right? So the details of what happens during the siege and in the massacre aren't clear even today. They certainly weren't clear in 1826, and this kind of uncertainty is present in all of history, but I want to emphasize that I think it's especially present in these most violent and shocking episodes of war. I'm not saying that history and fiction are the same here, and I think that all of the wonderful work that's gone into more accurately understanding these events over the past 75 years and even before that is testament to the fact that we can know these events better, right, and understand history more clearly, right? I'm just suggesting that some of the ways that Cooper, even though he's writing fiction, maybe he's not so different from some of the other people who have claimed to tell more purely factual versions of this story in the ensuing years. And that maybe what strikes us in listening to that language as a kind of manipulation of the event is in fact consistent with the historical record as he received it at the time in 1826. I'm almost done here. This is a painting by Thomas Cole of a scene in the novel. It's Cora kneeling before Tamarind. It's painted in 1827, almost immediately after this book comes out. Here we have an American painter, English-born, but lived most of his life in America, painting a subject from an American novel about American history, right? We see here the inklings of the birth of a kind of national culture that Cooper was committed to, and that Cole himself, who knew Cooper, they were members of a club together that sought to advance American cultural independence. They were working on this project, right? And it's beginning to happen here. It becomes possible in the 1820s to be something like a professional author, or to be something like a professional history painter. In the second volume of the book, the characters, as I've said, go back into the woods in pursuit of Magua, who's once again captured the girls. But this is a very different world that occupies the second volume of this novel, right? It's firstly, and most importantly, I think, the world of Native peoples where the landmarks that are so recognizable to the white characters in the first volume, the fort, the road, the lake, all of this disappears. Sometimes this world is comical, there's lots of costume changes, and there's some buffoonery with Hawkeye dressing up as a bear to join in a rescue, but it's also mysterious. Appearances in this world sort of swim and glitter, right? They'll see a colony of beavers and mistake it for a human village, right? Critics have noted the connections again to Shakespeare and the analogies to the woods in A Midsummer Night's Dream, right? Full of a certain kind of enchantment. This is a space, again, of imagination, of fancy, and of fiction, right? All of the things that Cooper says he's not doing in this narrative. Right? The long-dead Delaware chief Tamenund rises again. Monroe tags along, poor guy, but it's just clearly not his space, right? He's broken by sorrow, and he fades in and out of the plot almost at random. You'll say to yourself, wait, Monroe's still here. So this book never seems to me to plant both of its feet in history and fiction, or fiction. That's about the complexities that I talked about before, but it's also about it drawing its lasting power from this sort of cementing of a national historical imagination, right? Similar to the romantic imagination that we see Cole drawing here, right? Just notice the way that the figures of the novel get diminished here, right? He's taken us out of Lake George. These are scenes from the White Mountains in New Hampshire, where he'd recently been on his own aristocratic tour, right? So we're seeing multiple kinds of imagination mixing around with each other here. He's memorializing and extending a traumatic American memory, and he's also creating this national past, a heroic and natural age to be contrasted with the progressing, modernizing, but also perhaps more artificial and less noble world of the present day. Right? And the other thing, to take you back to where I started in this talk, that he's doing is he's consigning the native peoples of America to the past. Right? He's freezing them in this kind of farewell, right? In this last of the Mohicans idea. There's a really beautiful scene at the end, a funeral scene, where Cora and Uncas, who have both been killed, are laid down together in a native ceremony and imagined in a version of the afterlife where they can walk together in the happy hunting grounds. Cooper goes out of his way to make this rich and beautiful to us, and then also goes out of his way to make it clear that this is a fantasy, right? Not reality. This is imagination. And that Cora, but particularly Uncas, don't have a place in the history that's coming, right? That the native peoples are excluded from the nation, from the unum that they're trying to make out of the pluribus in this early American moment, right? It just isn't true, right? Again, there were Mohicans then, there are Mohicans now, descendants live in Wisconsin, right? But the after effects of this depiction still resonate, right? The Mohican people still have this idea of vanishing, of lastness, of being gone, tied to them, right? And resented, in my understanding, right? So this power cuts multiple ways, right? Memorializes our history, but also decides whose history it is, right? And reinforces the divisions that plague us, as well as sort of seeks to make them disappear. That's all I'll say about the novel for right now. But thank you for your kind attention, and I'm happy to take your questions.
Thank you, Nick, for a wonderful balance of the history and the fiction. My colleague, Bob Wilcox, is going to moderate Q&A, because I'm sure there's a lot of questions and comments out there. And we have a content expert, Andrew Menzie of Fort William Henry, if there's history questions you have based on the siege and other aspects of the French Indian War. So, Bob, moderate. Sure. Keep us moderated.
For a little structure, why don't we start on the right side? If there's questions in this right here, this area, raise your hand. Be acknowledged. Got to be a question. All right, ma'am.
You kind of alluded to this, but my bachelor's is archaeology, so I was really interested in like the first primary sources that Cooper had available to him at the time of writing the book. So I know you mentioned a couple of them, but if I could just jot those last names.
Yeah, sure, and I'm happy to give you the full version later, but the three I think most important are.
Nick, you gotta repeat your question.
Oh, sorry, yeah, I'll repeat the question. And someone with a master's, you said bachelor's? Bachelor's in archaeology, curious about his primary sources, right? So we have, let me get back to them here.
We have a couple of them, but.
Yeah, so there's Jonathan Carver's Travels Through America in the years 1766, 1767, 1768, which is a fascinating volume. What he's doing in this moment, he's an explorer as well as a veteran soldier. And he's actually describing the ways of Native Americans. There was a tremendous hunger for this kind of knowledge. And he inserts his experience at the fort as an anecdote into the middle of a description of Native American life, right? So that's interesting. Humphrey's Life of Putnam is the other one that you might take a look at. And then Timothy Dwight's Travels in New England is a third important one. There are a few more. If you're curious about this question, Ian Steele writes an article called Cooper and Cleo, which gives a good overview of the sources that he uses, both the ones that he does use and the ones that he doesn't, either because they're unavailable to him or he doesn't seek them out.
Thank you.
There's a question back here. This woman right here.
I was just curious about the Cooper's Cave connection. How did that work into it? Because I have a picture at home showing this wonderful cave. Lauren Blackburn, a local artist, painted it. And we went down to see it the other day, and it's this little crack in the stone. What did it look like? Why did he get that in some?
So, as I understand it, there are a couple of things happening there, right? One, and I was talking with someone about this earlier, the ways that our access to that site has changed, right?
Yes.
It used to be possible even for people who were here, I think, to go down and monkey around on those rocks, right? And explore what might have looked like a cave or something like that.
They were bigger.
What's that?
They were
They were
until
bigger.
the erosion came in.
Yeah. So there's also been hydrological, geological change as well that has scoured out that area. It's constantly changing, right? Another useful reminder, I think, that it's not just a question of humans and nature, right? But nature itself changing all
Yeah,
the
but how
time.
did he get, he maybe even never saw it.
No, he did. So we know from the journals of the men who were on that trip with him that happened in 1824 that he would have seen the falls and would have had, the story goes at least, relayed both by Smith, who was there, and by his daughter, that he had the idea for the book there, right? So looked down and saw this. This was, and this goes to the question of tourism too, this was already a popular stop-off for people who were coming up from the south, right? They would have gone to Glens Falls and then up to Lake George and then taken a little steamboat ride the way that Cooper did, right? He said the steamboat was incredibly slow. Yeah, so this is, people are beginning to take their leisure and beginning to understand the resources of this place. He was sick at the time, so there's a question about how actively he could have clambered around. That's okay.
In your research of Cooper, did you find any evidence for anti-French, anti-Papist type perspective? That was pretty common. The Nativist Party were starting the Know-Nothings in the following decade. There was a lot of colonial antipathy against the French and the
Yes.
Catholics, and Cooper being white Anglo-Saxon, good-looking Protestant.
Handsome fellow, should we go back to his picture? It's an interesting question, and I'll say that nothing.
Where's the question?
Oh, I'm sorry, I now failed twice to do that. So the question is about whether Cooper had particular anti-French antipathy, right? Our question asker asked about a sort of rising tide of bigotry against the French, against Catholics. This is a long story in the period that I study, especially among the Puritans. The hatred for Catholics is a burning fire. I have not in my research run across any reason to think that Cooper harbored any particularly strong anti-French feelings, although maybe someone here knows differently. He is quite hard on Montcalm. in his sort of review of the events that happened after the siege. He blames him quite directly for it, and includes, as I suggested in the quote, some what seemed to me fairly standard anti-French stereotypes, not of a particularly hateful kind, but that sense that there's something dandified, a little too elegant about them, right? And he disdain. A disdain, I think, is a good way of saying it. Yeah, and a real sense that part of his job here is to tarnish the reputation that he thinks was overly burnished by Montcalm's heroic death on the plains of Abraham. So he says, I know that many of you think of him as a hero now, but remember the way that his fair escutcheon was tarnished by these events and by the previous unruly surrender at Oswego that had happened.
Sir?
Yes, I know in the book there's various inconsistencies with the Native American tribes and who they were allied with and how Cooper portrays them, but I always wondered, he called the French Indians Mingos. I know there was Confederation in the Ohio area. Is that where, in your research, is that where he got that from? Why did he pick Mingos, that term? I always wondered.
That's where the term comes from that group, right? There's no sense in the book that Hawkeye or anyone else is using that term specifically. They interchange Mingo, Mengwe, and Makwa when they're talking about these dogs, right? These dogs of Makwas or something like that. My reading of the novel, at least, and of the little bit that I've encountered about how Cooper used that term, doesn't suggest that he was alluding to that particular group in Pennsylvania, Ohio, right, sort of that area. Yeah, that he's, I think, aware of the diversity of Iroquois tribes. But in a lot of places, he sort of takes a pass. He does this on the casualties from the fort as well. I didn't repeat the question again. Will you yell at me every time? The question is about where he gets the term Mingo, and I think he's using it as a general term, is my answer, right? And frequently, he sort of steps back and says, good enough, right? And I think this is one of those moments where he does that. But yes, that's where I understand the term coming from, but I don't get the sense that Cooper is invested in the specifics of that question. Is that helpful?
Yes, thank you.
Any other questions from the right side? No? How about the left side?
I heard from another speaker that we had here several years ago that Cooper was quite ill with a fever when he was dictating those chapters to his wife. Can you confirm that?
There is a story about that he wakes up in a fever dream and imagines Cora and Makwa sort of struggling with each other, right, and reels off chapters of this, right? As far as I know, that's authentic. Yeah, I recommend to you, for those of you who have the stomach for it, Wayne Franklin's biography of Cooper, which is an impressive work, 2 massive doorstop volumes so far, running to 1,800 pages or something like that. He makes quite a deal, not just out of that event, out of Cooper's illness, but out of the fact that Cooper was sick through this whole process, right? That he was actually quite unwell. It's never entirely clear exactly what his complaint was, but yes, apparently that's part of it, and adds to the sort of romantic or visionary idea of this novel, I think, right? A little bit like Coleridge waking from his opium dream and, narrating Kubla Khan or something like that. Yeah, it's an exciting literary anecdote, but yeah, I think it's, as far as I know, it's true.
Oh, sorry, was that William?
William Franklin, is that what you said?
Wayne, is the first name?
Wayne is
Oh, Wayne, thank you.
Gentleman in the back with the white shirt?
I'm a little confused about this idea that the aftermath of the book resulted in this negative, the French were at fault.
Mm-hmm.
Didn't it have a much more profound impact on the way people thought about Native Americans? This was a point in history where we're talking about the forced removal of the Cherokee from Georgia. It seems like those were the issues of the time, and this would have had a much more profound impact on the public and the way they thought of Native Americans in a negative way.
A question, did everyone hear that? The question about whether this would have stoked anti-Native feeling more so than anti-French feeling in this moment. I think that's one of the ways to read this. Francis Parkman, who's a 19th century historian, describes this moment, this chain of events and talks constantly about the wolves, right? These wolves, these native wolves, right? This animalizing language, right? And many historians have made the point that the treaty that's signed in 1763 that concludes the 7 Years' War and our theater of the French and Indian War is a disaster for Native Americans, right? And removes a conflicted and complicated but relatively stable multi-party arrangement in which there were British and French and Native claims on this land, right? It takes away essentially that third party and makes it possible for Anglo-Americans whose numbers will explode over the coming decades, right? For those who are interested, I won't try to come up with them on the spot, but the way that the numbers jump in places like Indiana between 1810 and 1830 are phenomenal, from like, you know, a few thousand people to hundreds of thousands, right? These are settlers coming out, right? This is inflaming feeling, but that moment, that 1763 moment, makes possible this division in which there is an advancing sort of white civilization on one side and a retreating native civilization on the other side. What I meant in referring to those particular newspaper articles is that the British are in that moment engaged in a hot war with the French, right? And I think their immediate reaction, at least in my reading of those newspaper articles, is to certainly to demonize the natives in the way that Cooper does, but to focus most of their political and propagandistic efforts on their immediate imperial enemies, the French. Does that make sense? But I think in the long term, yes, absolutely, that this book builds on a tradition of Indian hating, to be correct. It's not a particularly egregious example of Indian hating in early 19th century literature. I can point you sadly to stronger examples of that, but yes, I think those looking for material in this attack, for thinking of Native Americans as instinctively savage, would have found it both in this book and in the other materials.
So it would have been like he was responsible for the stereotypical version of Native Americans, both as the noble savage and the heathen savage.
Yes.
And also, he's probably the forerunner to Manifest Destiny with this whole book.
Yes, so I would say that it's really hard for me. The question here is whether he is, how he's implicated in the stereotyping of the Native American as either noble or savage, and to what extent he is involved in what we'll come to call Manifest Destiny, right? This idea that American civilization would advance to the West Coast and not stop until it got there, and indeed it does across the 19th century. The change is incredible, right? I think it's hard to directly connect this novel to those cultural events which had other drivers, right, and of which we might think of this book as a sort of symptom, right, as much as a cause. Nonetheless, I think the language that he uses, and I quoted some of it, right, contributes precisely to this idea, right, that there is some nobility and some savagery, but that finally it's the savagery that seems to win out, right? He describes in that passage that I had you read them running instinctively toward blood, right? I think there's a sense consistently throughout the novel for all of his ambivalent feelings about his Mohican characters, all of the ways in which Uncas is really studly, like really attractive in this book. There's a stronger, or at least a strongly counterbalancing sense that Native Americans are somehow subhuman. Yeah. I think it's fair to say.
No, yeah, he just got rid of the good guys.
Yeah.
There are no good guys left.
Yeah. Yeah, and who's left, right? His heroes, yeah.
I was just going to mention that what you're all talking about, that's the culture of the British Empire. It wasn't just the American indigenous people, it was the people who inhabited India. Everywhere that they went, all that red stuff.
A little louder, sorry for that. Yeah.
Well, you got the legacy of the English Empire in American culture.
Yeah.
And that's it. I mean, all these people are subhuman.
Yeah.
that great big pink thing on the, on the maps when I was a kid. That was the empire, and it changed the culture everywhere.
Yeah, so, and I think that's, and probably we're moving beyond the place where I have any special expertise here, but just to say that I think the question is complicated and multifactorial, right? Why does Cooper write the way he does? Well, some of it is a instinctively imperial mindset, right? Some of it is a moment in which there are active sort of humanitarian discussions about whether it might be best for Native peoples to move beyond the Mississippi River for their own protection, right? That logic seems to me self-serving, but I think there were good-hearted people raising those kinds of questions. This was a complicated question at this moment. I should say that Cooper himself was a supporter of Indian removal, but I think from the evidence of his literary treatments, a conflicted supporter of this, right? And I think while we want to recognize the harmful stereotypes in this book, I think we also don't want to entirely ignore his engagement with Uncas and Chingachgook and the degree to which Natty Bumppo has to keep telling us that he's not Indian, right? He says it over and over and over again in this book because we, on some level, assume that he is, and on some level, he wants to be. And on some level, the boys reading this book want to be, right? Not just boys, of course, right? This is kind of a famous boys book. And Bumppo himself is kind of a boy, right? Not very interested in girls, wanting to run around with his buddies and no one. So this Leslie Fiedler's Love and Death in the American Novel is a beautiful book about this desire, right? This desire among white men to return to a purer and more authentic state that they associate often in cases like this with nativeness.
Bruce?
When Cooper's touring Lake George, I've been told that he saw Shelving Rock and that was an inspiration for the final scene with the fight and everything like that. Have you heard that, or is that true, or what do you think?
I have nothing to contribute to that. Sorry.
Sorry to stop.
No. I believe it might be true. Yeah. Yeah, I will say that in that, I mean, I said that, alluded to that in the first volume. I feel like we know exactly where we are in a lot of places, right? Like we can almost put ourselves on a map, and in that second volume, it's harder for me to tell where we are, but I could certainly imagine.
I'll stick to the story then.
Sounds good. I'm gonna take it. I'm gonna start counting everything.
Any other questions? Yes, Todd.
Do you think the French treated the Indians as equals and the British looked down upon them?
No.
That's not the sense that I get from this particular moment, right? I guess my reading of what happens with Montcalm and his allies is that he takes for granted their presence and their acquiescence in this. I'll shout out again to Bellico's book, Empire in the Mountains, when he talks about the diversity of the native allies who came to Montcalm's call, dozens of tribes, right? Some of them canoe from 1,000 miles away, right? And Montcalm is essentially telling them, sorry, these are our friends now, right? You've got to go home empty-handed, which does not seem to me like the behavior of a friend in this moment. And indeed, there were native allies, as I'm sure, much better native allies among those at the fort as well, right? So, yeah, this is not a one-sided story in this way, and I think if anything, Cooper simplifies the story. Yeah, that would be my answer.
I recall finding the novel very difficult to read. That it was extremely wordy, point of frustration. Was that typical of the day? Was that his style, or was he paid by the word, or what?
Yeah, I think it's a feeling of his too. Have you read Mark Twain's The Literary Crimes of James Fenimore Cooper? I recommend it to you. It's a very funny send-up of exactly that you're talking about, where Twain will rewrite his sentences. He'll say, he takes all this time to say he sat down at the campfire. Wouldn't have that been I agree with you. I think sometimes, and you have some examples even here, right, of moments where he lets his senses get away from him. I think he is a master of action. I think he makes exciting scenes exciting. As for his line level prose, I'm about as impressed as you are.
One more question, anyone here? Are we done? We're done.
I'm sorry.